Hello everyone, I am your storyteller for today, and I'll be keeping you company. I know you use this video to help you fall asleep, so before that, give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. Additionally, where are you from? And what time is it where you are watching this? Get comfortable and relax. People always warn you about driving through Appalachia after dark, but when you've made the trip a dozen times without incident, you start thinking they're just being dramatic. I'd been making quarterly runs from Charlotte to Cincinnati for my medical equipment sales territory since finishing college in 2012. And nothing worse than a speeding ticket had ever happened. That particular October night. Heading back south after a successful week of demos, I figured I'd push through instead of stopping at a motel. My daughter's third birthday party was the next morning, and I promised her I'd be there when she woke up, around 11:30. Just past the Virginia state line where the mountains get especially dark and cell towers become suggestions rather than guarantees. My front right tire exploded like a shotgun blast. The Ford Explorer jerked hard to the right, and I fought the wheel to keep from careening into the guardrail that separated me from a 100-foot drop into pure blackness. Gravel sprayed as I managed to ease onto the shoulder, heart hammering against my ribs while the ruined tire flopped its final death throes against the asphalt. When I finally stopped and killed the engine, the silence hit me harder than the blowout had. No traffic, no streetlights. Just my hazard lights painting the rock face beside me in rhythmic orange pulses. I grabbed my phone from the cup holder and watched it search desperately for a signal that wasn't coming. The nearest town, according to the last sign I'd passed, was 17 miles behind me. I popped the trunk, grabbed the spare and the jack, and got to work by the light of my phone's flashlight, telling myself this was just another minor inconvenience in a long list of minor inconveniences that came with the territory. 20 minutes into wrestling with rusted lug nuts that hadn't been touched since the Explorer rolled off the assembly line, I heard the engine. Not the high whine of a sedan or the rumble of a semi, but the distinctive rattle of an older diesel pickup. The kind where you can hear each piston doing its job. The sound grew louder, echoing off the mountain walls, then began to slow. Relief washed through me as I stood up, wiping grease on my khakis, ready to flag down what I assumed would be a good Samaritan. But the truck didn't pull up beside me or even ahead of me. It stopped about 30 feet back, and then the headlights went dark. Just killed them completely, leaving only my hazards and the dim glow of my phone on the ground to fight against the mountain darkness. The doors opened and closed with deliberate precision. Not slammed, just firmly shut, like they were trying not to wake someone. My eyes strained to adjust, making out to shapes moving toward me in the pulsing orange light, one tall and lean, wearing what looked like a baseball cap. The other shorter but broader, built like someone who'd spent years hauling feed bags or working construction. Neither one called out a greeting, didn't ask if I needed help, didn't say a single word. They just kept walking toward me with this measured pace, like they'd done this exact thing before and knew precisely how it would go. The tall one had something in his right hand, held low against his leg, and I couldn't tell if it was a tool or something else entirely. Evening, I tried, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. Thanks for stopping, but I've got the spare right here. Should be good in a few minutes. The shorter one let out this small laugh, not a friendly chuckle, but something that made my mouth go dry. They kept coming, spreading apart now, one moving toward the front of my Explorer, the other circling behind. The tire iron was still in my hand from working on the lug nuts, and I found myself gripping it tighter. The cold metal suddenly feeling both reassuring and pathetically inadequate. The tall one finally spoke, his voice carrying a local drawl thick as molasses. That's a nice watch you got there. Rolex? It wasn't. Just a Seiko my wife had given me for our anniversary, but the way he said it, the way his eyes tracked to my wrist and then to the Explorer, to my laptop bag visible through the back window, I understood exactly what this was. The shorter one had positioned himself between me and the driver's door, while his partner stood blocking any path toward the front of the vehicle. They'd done this before, probably dozens of times. Picking off travelers on this stretch of mountain highway where screams wouldn't carry and help wouldn't come. Wallet, phone. Watch, whatever's in the vehicle, the tall one said, finally raising what I could now see was a crowbar. Tapping it against his palm in a rhythm that matched my hazard lights. Make this easy on yourself. But something in their eyes. In the way they kept glancing at each other with these little nods and signals. Told me that easy wasn't really on the menu tonight. They weren't just here for the robbery. There was something else. Something in the shorter one's expression when he looked at my Explorer, at the child's car seat visible in the back. The stick. Figure family decal on the rear window. He was calculating, measuring distances. Probably figuring out how long it would take to move my vehicle. Where they could dump it. Here is the thing, the shorter one said, pulling out what looked like a folding knife. Letting it catch the orange light as he opened it with practiced ease. Sometimes people report their cars stolen. Say they got robbed, make all kinds of trouble for honest folks just trying to make a living. Can't have that. He took a step closer, and I could smell cigarettes and something chemical on his clothes, maybe meth. Maybe just industrial cleaner. So we're gonna take a little ride together. Make sure you understand the importance of keeping quiet. That's when I knew with absolute certainty that getting in that truck meant never seeing my daughter blow out her birthday candles. The tire iron in my hand suddenly felt like my only chance, and I could see them both tensing. Reading my body language just as clearly as I was reading theirs. The tall one moved first. Swinging the crowbar in a wide arc meant to catch me in the ribs, but adrenaline had already taken over. I stepped inside his reach and brought the tire iron up hard, catching him under the chin with a crack that sent him stumbling backward into the guardrail. The shorter one lunged with the knife, and I felt it slice through my jacket, burning across my left arm. But momentum carried me forward, and I drove my shoulder into his chest, sending us both sprawling onto the gravel. We rolled. Fighting for control of the knife, rocks digging into my back, his breath hot and sour in my face. I managed to get my knee up between us and pushed hard, creating enough space to swing the tire iron again. It connected with his wrist, and the knife went skittering across the asphalt. Behind me, I could hear the tall one groaning. Trying to get back on his feet, spitting what sounded like blood and broken teeth. The shorter one scrambled for his knife. But I was already moving, pure survival instinct, driving me toward the Explorer. I yanked the door open, dove inside, and hit the locks, just as the tall one slammed into the passenger window, leaving a bloody smear across the glass. The engine turned over on the first try, thank God, and I threw it in drive. Even with the ruined tire flopping against the wheel well, the truck was still behind me, blocking a clean escape. So I did the only thing I could think of. I slammed it in reverse and floored it. The Explorer lurched backward on 3 good tires and 1 rim, throwing sparks. The impact threw both men diving to either side, and I heard their truck's headlights shatter, the crunch of metal on metal. Then I was spinning the wheel, grinding forward, the rims screaming against asphalt as I pushed the Explorer to move, to get away. To get anywhere but here. They tried to follow. Of course they did. In my rearview mirror, I could see their truck lurching to life, one headlight now dark, weaving as they tried to match my erratic path. But their confidence was shaken, and my desperation gave me an edge. I rode that rim for 3 miles, sparks flying. The whole vehicle shaking like it might come apart, until I saw lights ahead. A 24-hour gas station, bright as heaven. With 2 semus parked outside and a state trooper filling up his cruiser. I practically crashed into the parking lot. Horn blaring, blood soaking through my jacket sleeve. Screaming for help before I even got the door open. The trooper had his hand on his weapon before he saw my condition. Saw the destroyed wheel, the blood on my window, and suddenly everyone was moving, calling for backup, calling for an ambulance. They caught them 40 minutes later, trying to take a back road around a roadblock. Turns out I wasn't their first victim. Not even close, the police found personal items from at least 12 other travelers in their truck. Wallets and watches and phones, some dating back to years. 3 of those people had been reported missing. Their vehicles never found. The shorter one, whose name turned out to be Carl Breton, broke first and told them everything. About the ravine where they'd been dumping cars, about how they'd been working that stretch of highway since his cousin, Roy, got out of prison. Roy, the tall one, needed reconstructive jaw surgery and faced charges that would keep him locked up for the rest of his life. Carl got 25 years in exchange for his cooperation. They found 2 bodies in that ravine. 2 people who hadn't been as lucky as me, who hadn't fought back fast enough or hard enough. I made it to my daughter's birthday party, arm in a sling. Stitches pulling every time I moved, but I was there when she woke up, just like I promised. When she asked why I had a bandage, I told her Daddy had gotten a little hurt, but was all better now. The truth was, I still wake up sometimes thinking I hear the diesel engine slowing down behind me. I've changed my route. Started flying instead of driving when possible. And I never travel those mountain roads after dark anymore. My wife wanted me to go to therapy, and I did for a while. But talking about it didn't change what I knew in my bones. I'd come within seconds of disappearing forever on that dark highway. Of becoming just another missing person case that goes cold after a few months. The Explorer's gone. Traded in for something newer, but I kept the tire iron. It's sitting in my garage now. Still dented where it connected with Roy's jaw. This thing is a constant reminder, sometimes. The only thing standing between you and the darkness is your willingness to fight like hell for the dawn. Rain doesn't usually sound angry. But that afternoon in the mountains near Breckenridge, it was pounding my Subaru's windshield hard enough to crack glass. Early November. And I'd been driving back from a conference in Denver when I decided to take what Google Maps promised was a scenic shortcut. 26 and convinced I knew better than the locals who'd warned me about storm season. I'd laughed off their concerns about mountain weather. My phone had 1 bar of signal that kept flickering in and out. The engine wouldn't even try to turn over anymore, and the temperature gauge on my dashboard showed it was dropping fast outside. Steam started rising from under the hood, mixing with the rain until I couldn't see 10 feet ahead when that beat-up Ford pickup pulled up behind me. Hazards flashing through the gray curtain of water, I didn't hesitate to roll down my window. He had one of those faces that made you think of old photographs, weathered and somehow timeless. Maybe 40, something with deep-set eyes that caught the dashboard light in a way that made them look almost silver. Said his name was Glenn, worked maintenance for the county. And he'd seen too many folks get stuck on this stretch during storm season to just drive past. His voice had this quality to it. Soft, but clear. Like he was used to talking to spooked animals or scared children. He helped me push the car further onto the shoulder. Tied a bright orange flag to the antenna so other drivers would see it, and offered to drive me down to Millbrook. This little nothing of a town, about 15 minutes further into the valley, where at least I could wait out the storm somewhere warm. The whole ride down, he kept both hands on the wheel. Told me about how these roads used to be mining trails. How his grandfather had worked the copper veins that ran through these mountains before the industry dried up. Millbrook consisted of maybe 12 buildings huddled together like they were trying to stay warm. Most of them were dark except for a general store with a flickering neon sign that read Provisions and Sundries, with half the letters burned out. Glenn pulled up right to the door, even got out in that torrential rain to help me with my backpack, making sure I made it inside before driving off. I wanted to thank him properly, maybe offer him gas money or something. But by the time I turned around after pushing through the door, his taillights were already disappearing into the storm. The store smelled like old coffee and wet wool. And behind the counter sat this woman with gray hair pulled back so tight it stretched her features. Watching me like I just tracked mud across her clean floor, which I probably had. She introduced herself as Dolores. Owned the place for 37 years, she said. And she had that way of talking where every statement sounded like an accusation. When I explained about my car and Glenn giving me a ride, her whole expression shifted. Went from suspicious to something I couldn't quite read. She kept asking me to describe him again. What exactly did he look like? What exactly did he say? Even made me repeat the part about his grandfather and the copper mines twice. Then she got real quiet. Started organizing things behind the counter that didn't need organizing. And finally said there wasn't anybody named Glenn working maintenance for the county. Hadn't been 4 years. The way she said it made all the warmth from the heated store suddenly feel insufficient before I could ask what she meant. The lights flickered and we heard this sound like thunder, except it kept going, kept building. Until the windows were rattling in their frames. Dolores grabbed a flashlight from under the counter. Her nickel's white around it, and we both went to the window to look out. The rain had turned into something biblical. Water was rushing down the street like a river had decided to relocate, carrying branches and debris and things I couldn't identify in the dark. Then the real thunder came, and with the lightning flash, I saw cars being pushed sideways down what used to be the main road. Saw a whole tree floating past like driftwood. Dolores grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks and pulled me away from the window. Said we needed to get to the back room, get to higher ground. That this was worse than 1987, and that one killed 3 people. We spent 4 hours in that back room, sitting on boxes of canned goods while the building groaned and water seeped under the door, rising inch by inch until it covered our shoes. Dolores had this battery-powered radio, and through the static, we heard snippets about flash flood warnings, about roads washing out, about emergency services unable to reach the area until morning, every time lightning lit up the small window. I could see her staring at me with this expression I couldn't interpret, like she was trying to solve a puzzle that scared her. Around midnight, when the water finally started receding and the rain eased to something merely torrential, she asked me again about Glenn, about whether I was absolutely certain that was the name he gave me. When I said yes, she pulled out this old photo album from a plastic tub, pages water, damaged and yellow, and showed me a picture from 1973, pointing at a man standing next to a county maintenance truck. A man with silver eyes and that same weathered face. His name was Glenn Hartley, she said, and he'd been one of the best workers the county ever had. Knew every road and trail in these mountains like they were carved into his memory. Problem was, he disappeared during a flood in 1974, him and a woman named Beverly who'd been passing through just like me. They found his truck weeks later, buried in mud at the bottom of Sawmill Canyon, but never found either body. And people in town had been telling stories ever since about seeing him during storms, always helping stranded motorists. Always disappearing before anyone could pin down exactly where he'd gone. Dolores said she'd never believed those stories. Thought they were just mountain folklore, the kind of thing people tell themselves to make sense of tragedies. But here I was, describing him perfectly, down to the way he held the steering wheel and the stories about his grandfather in the mines. Morning came slow and gray, with emergency crews finally making it through on the one road that hadn't completely washed out. They brought news that made everyone in the store go silent, made Dolores grip my shoulder until it hurt. My Subaru had been found 2 miles downstream, wrapped around a concrete culvert with the driver's side completely crushed. Would have killed anyone inside instantly, they said. But that wasn't the part that made people start whispering. It wasn't the part that made the sheriff show up an hour later with his laptop, asking to see the store's security footage. The timestamp on the external camera showed 7:47 p.m., just after dark. And there was Glenn's truck, clear as day, him dragging something heavy toward the river. Something wrapped in a tarp that left drag marks in the mud. The sheriff kept replaying it, zooming in, trying to make sense of what we were seeing, because the figure doing the dragging had my height, my build. Even seemed to be wearing my conference lanyard that was still somehow visible in the grainy footage. They searched the riverbank for 3 days while I stayed in town. First because the roads were impassable, then because the sheriff had questions, lots of questions. Where exactly had Glenn picked me up? What exactly had we talked about? Did I remember anything unusual about the drive down to town? I kept telling them the same story. Kept describing that 20-minute ride in detail, but the more I talked, the more I noticed gaps. Little moments that seemed to skip like a scratched record. I couldn't remember getting out of his truck exactly. Couldn't remember the space between being in the passenger seat and standing at the store's door. The sheriff showed me the footage again and again, that figure in the rain dragging something, and each time I watched it, I felt this crawling sensation in my chest, like my body remembered something my mind wouldn't let me access. On the 3rd day, a volunteer search team found something that changed everything. Made the sheriff stop asking questions and start looking at me differently. Half a mile downstream from where they'd found my car, tangled in tree roots along the bank, they pulled out a woman's body that had been in the water for decades, preserved by the cold mountain runoff. She was wearing polyester bottoms and a macrame vest. Had a driver's license in her pocket that read Beverly Marsh, issued in 1974, but here is what nobody could explain. What made even the sheriff's hands unsteady when he showed me the evidence bag? She was wearing my conference badge from Denver, the one with my photo and this year's date, wrapped around her waterlogged neck like she'd grabbed it in the dark and never let go. The badge I thought I'd been wearing in the security footage. The one I couldn't find in my backpack no matter how many times I searched through it. The sheriff finally let me leave after the state police got involved. After they ran every test they could think of and found nothing that made sense. My prints weren't on the badge around Beverly's neck. The security footage was too grainy to prove anything definitively. And 3 witnesses had seen me in the store during the time the video showed someone by the river. They gave me back my belongings, drove me to the nearest rental car agency in the next town over, and suggested, strongly, that I might want to take a different route home, but before I left, Dolores pulled me aside in the parking lot, pressed something into my palm, an old brasky with a number worn almost smooth. She said it was from Glenn's old locker at the county maintenance depot. Said maybe I should look inside before I tried to make sense of anything. Said sometimes the mountains keep their own kind of records that have nothing to do with what people write down in official reports. I drove to the depot on my way out of town. Found the building half collapsed and abandoned for decades, according to the dates on the condemned notices. Locker 47 was in the back, rusted but still solid, and inside I found a leather journal wrapped in plastic. Pages filled with Glenn's handwriting. The last entry was dated the day before he disappeared. And it described picking up a woman named Beverly, whose car had broken down, described the way she trusted him immediately. Described how he'd thought about all the other women who'd vanished on these mountain roads over the years. Women the police never looked for the hard. But the next pages were different, written in shaky script. Like someone writing in the dark. They described waking up in cold water, described being pulled by currents but unable to drown. Described seeing through eyes that weren't quite his anymore, doing things he couldn't stop. The final entry just said, "The mountains remember everything, and during storms, they make us remember too." I left the journal where I found it. Drove home without stopping, and I've never taken a mountain road again. Especially not during storm season. Especially not when helpful strangers offer rides to anywhere that sounds too good to be true. College was supposed to prepare you for everything. But nobody tells you that 6 months after graduation, you'll be living in your childhood bedroom again. Staring at the same posters you hung up in high school. That's where I found myself in early March. scrolling through job listings and feeling like the walls were closing in. My buddy Jason called me up one night. Said he needed to get out of town for a few days, clear his head after his engagement fell apart. We settled on a 4-day hike through the Appalachian Trail section in Pennsylvania. Nothing too ambitious. Just enough to feel like we were doing something with our lives. I packed my gear that same night. Desperate for any excuse to escape the suffocating routine of failed interviews and my parents' worried glances, we started our hike on a Wednesday morning. The kind of crisp spring day that makes you believe everything might actually work out. Jason barely spoke for the first few hours. Just walked with that mechanical rhythm people get when they're trying to outrun their thoughts. Around noon, dark clouds started rolling in from the west, and by 3 o'clock, the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. Rain started as a drizzle, then turned into sheets of water that soaked through our rain gear within minutes. We were 8 miles from the nearest road, pushing forward on a narrow trail that had turned into a muddy stream. That's when we spotted the shelter through the trees. One of those 3-sided wooden structures the trail maintenance crews build for emergencies. We practically ran for it. Our boots making sucking sounds with each step, grateful for any protection from the storm that was turning day into twilight. The shelter was basic but solid, maybe 12 feet deep, with a wooden floor raised off the ground and a slanted roof that extended past the open front. Someone had carved initials and dates into the support beams, going back decades. And there was a logbook in a plastic bag hanging from a nail. The place smelled like wet wood and something else. Something sour that made me wrinkle my nose. Jason dropped his pack and started pulling out his sleeping bag while I checked the corners with my headlamp. Finding old spider webs and mouse droppings, but nothing too concerning. We strung up a clothesline and hung our soaked jackets. Then sat on the wooden platform, eating cold granola bars and watching the rain turn the trail into a river. By 6 o'clock, it was completely dark, except for the occasional lightning flash that lit up the forest like a photograph. The temperature kept dropping, and we could see our breath-forming clouds in the beam of our headlamps. Around 9 o'clock, we decided to call it a night since there wasn't much else to do. I set up my sleeping bag on the left side of the shelter while Jason took the right, leaving a gap in the middle where we'd stacked our packs. The rain hammered on the tin roof with a sound like radio static, occasionally punctuated by thunder that seemed to shake the whole structure. I remember lying there in my sleeping bag, listening to the storm and thinking how different this was from my bedroom at home, how the darkness here had weight to it. Pressed against the shelter from all sides, Jason was already snoring softly. That deep sleep that comes from emotional exhaustion. I pulled my sleeping bag up to my chin and closed my eyes, letting the white noise of the rain pull me under. It must have been around midnight when something woke me up, though at first I couldn't tell what it was through the fog of sleep and the constant drumming of rain overhead. Then I heard it again, cutting through the rain like it was meant to be heard, a dragging sound, slow and deliberate, like someone pulling a heavy sack across wet leaves. It started somewhere to the left of the shelter and moved steadily along the side wall, scraping and rustling with a rhythm that had nothing to do with wind or falling branches. I held my breath, every muscle in my body going rigid inside the sleeping bag. The dragging stopped right at the corner where the wall met the open front of the shelter, and for maybe 10 seconds, there was just the rain. Then came footsteps, or what might have been footsteps, heavy and uneven, squelching in the mud just beyond where I could see. They moved along the front of the shelter, paused, moved again, like someone was examining the entrance. I wanted to wake Jason but couldn't make myself move. Couldn't even turn my head to look at him. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whatever was out there could hear it over the storm. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the shelter's opening. I could feel eyes on me. That primitive sensation that makes every hair on your body stand up. Lightning flashed, and for a split second, I saw a shape. Tall and wrong somehow, But the image burned out before my brain could process what I was looking at. Then came a sound that made my whole body go cold. A wet breathing, ragged and thick, like someone with fluid in their lungs trying to catch their breath. It went on for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 seconds, this horrible wheezing just feet from where we lay. Something scraped against the wooden frame of the entrance, testing it, exploring the edges. Then furked without warning. Something slammed into the side wall with enough force to shake dust from the rafters. The whole shelter creaked and groaned. Another impact, this time lower, like someone throwing their shoulder against the boards. Jason jerked awake with a gasp. His headlamp clicking on and swinging wildly around the shelter. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his voice cracking. Before I could answer, we heard the dragging sound again, this time moving around to the back wall. Jason grabbed his knife from his pack, a folding blade maybe 4 inches long that looked pathetically small in his shaking hand. We sat there in our sleeping bags, backs pressed against the wall, listening to whatever it was circle the shelter. The scraping sounds moved up the back wall, like someone running their fingers along the wood, searching for weak spots. Then came a different noise, metal on wood, rhythmic and deliberate. Prying sounds. Something was working at the boards near the corner, trying to create an opening. We could hear wood splintering. Nails groaning under pressure. I grabbed my hiking pole and extended it, holding it like a spear. Knowing how useless it would be, but needing something in my hands. The prying continued for maybe 5 minutes. Patient and methodical, while we sat there, barely breathing, waiting for boards to give way. Then everything stopped. No footsteps, no breathing, no scraping. Just rain and our own panicked heartbeats. We stayed frozen like that for another hour. Maybe 2, taking turns keeping watch while the other pretended to rest. Neither of us actually slept. Every sound made us jump. Every shadow that moved with the lightning had us gripping our pathetic weapons tighter. When the first gray light of dawn finally filtered through the rain, we could see the damage on the shelter's entrance frame, deep gouges in the wood, fresh and raw. Following the edge where a door would have been if the shelter had one. Splinters hung like teeth from the marks. Jason stood up first, moving carefully to the entrance and peering out into the misty morning. The rain had softened to a drizzle, and we could see maybe 20 feet into the forest. That's when he pointed to something in the mud. About 10 feet from the shelter. A backpack, torn nearly in half, its contents scattered and soaked. It was bright blue. Practically new, looking except for the damage. Definitely not something that had been sitting out there for weeks. We packed our gear in record time, neither of us saying what we were both thinking. Jason picked up the torn backpack with a stick, and we could see a name written in marker on the inside flap, Kevin Hartwell. There was a wallet in the side pocket, somehow still intact, with a Pennsylvania driver's license showing a guy who looked about our age, smiling in that awkward DMV way. The photo was dated just 2 months ago. We found more of his stuff scattered in widening circles around the shelter. A water bottle with teeth marks that went clean through the plastic, shreds of what might have been a tent. A boot with the laces still tied. The other boot was nowhere to be found. Jason took photos of everything with his phone. His hands trembling so bad, most of them came out blurry. We debated calling for help right then, but we had no signal, and honestly, we just wanted to get away from that place as fast as possible. The trail back was a muddy nightmare. But we practically jogged through it, looking behind us every few seconds, jumping at every snapped twig. It took us 4 hours to reach the parking area where we'd left Jason's car. About half the time it had taken us to hike in. We drove straight to the ranger station in town. Our clothes still soaked and covered in mud. The ranger, an older woman with gray hair pulled back in a ponytail, listened to our story with an expression that went from skeptical to concerned as Jason showed her the photos. She made us write out statements while she called it in, and within an hour, there were state police cars in the parking lot. They found Kevin Hartwell 3 days later, about a mile from the shelter. I won't describe what condition he was in because, honestly, they didn't tell us much. Just that he'd been out there for at least a week. The official report said he'd gotten lost during the storm and died of exposure, that animals had done the rest. They didn't mention the gouges we'd photographed on the shelter or explain how his backpack ended up torn apart in front of it, or what had tried to break in while we were inside. They definitely didn't explain what we heard that night. Jason and I don't really talk anymore. Not because we had a falling out or anything, but because every conversation eventually circles back to that night. And neither of us wants to go there. He moved to Arizona a few months later, said he needed more sun. But I think he just wanted to get far away from forests and rain. I still live in Pennsylvania. Got a job at an accounting firm that's about as far from outdoor adventure as you can get. Sometimes I'll see a missing hiker report on the news and my chest gets tight. Wondering if they'll be found the way Kevin was found. I did some research after we got back. Spent way too many nights going down rabbit holes about that particular stretch of trail. Turns out there have been 6 disappearances in that area over the past 15 years, also low hikers. All during or right after bad weather. The bodies they found were always attributed to exposure or wildlife. But the ones they didn't find, well, those just stayed mysteries. Here is what keeps me up at night. Whatever was out there knew exactly what it was doing. The way it circled the shelter, tested for weaknesses. Worked at the boards with tools. That wasn't some rabid animal or confused bear. It was intelligent, patient, methodical. And it had been watching Kevin Hartwell for who knows how long before it got him. Maybe it had been watching us too. Waiting for one of us to step outside to use the bathroom or check out a noise. The only thing that saved us was staying put until daylight. I've never told anyone this part. But when we were packing up to leave that morning, I found something pressed into the mud right by where I'd been sleeping. A handprint, clear as day, but wrong. The fingers were too long, maybe 8 inches each, and there were only 3 of them. Plus what might have been a thumb. Jason was already heading down the trail, so I just stared at it for a second. Then kicked mud over it and ran after him. Some things you just don't need to share, you know? Some things are better left covered up.